USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Spotlight, a weekly podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com, featuring conversations with college hockey coaches and players and journalists who cover the sport.
Welcome to USCHO Spotlight for Wednesday, March 11th, 2020. We're sponsored by the NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th in Detroit. For tickets, visit ncaa.com/Frozen4. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. And Jim, this is a special edition of Spotlight where you and I are going to take a little bit of an analysis of the PairWise Rankings, see who's in, who's not in, what some teams need to do, and also answer some questions. We got a whole ton of questions in earlier today from folks via Twitter asking about specific teams and some general thoughts. But I guess the first thing for us to talk about is the PairWise itself. And one thing that's interesting to me, Jim, is how the PairWise has kind of evolved over the last several years, essentially taking some criteria out so that it heavily relies on the ratings percentage index, or RPI.
Well, certainly it has changed a lot. And, you go back to a coach was on the phone with me this week. We were trying to figure out when the criteria that developed the PairWise was put in place. And it was the mid 90s. I'm going to say somewhere around 94, 95 in that range. But, the PairWise comes from U.S. College Hockey Online. There were a group of, I'm going to call them mathematical geniuses, I could call them nerds as well, that figured out exactly how to mimic the system, how to figure out what the system did. And, the system was a very statistical-based system. It still is, back in the late 90s. And these people figured out what it took to create exactly the algorithm to figure out who would be in and who would be out of the NCAA tournament. Over that time, so many things have changed. The criteria especially has changed. And I think the biggest criteria that was removed over the time was your record over your last certain number of games. I think there was a record over your last 20 was in there. They changed it to 16. I don't know if it ever got less than that, but that was removed, I'm going to say about 5 to 6 years ago, maybe even more. And the reason was because teams did not play a like schedule over their last 16 games, so they felt it was unfair to just measure a 16-game period or a 20-game period, whatever it was. When that happened, that really put our criteria down to such a selective few. Head-to-head, which you don't always play head-to-head games against one another. Common opponents, so if you played games against the same team when you're comparing one team to another, that's always used. And then the last one is RPI. And RPI is a balance, an equation that takes 25% of your winning percentage, 21% of your opponent's winning percentage, and 54% of your opponent's winning percentage. You come up with a number off of that, and your RPI then is basically a number that almost dictates your position in the PairWise right now. Why do I say that? Because it has power. Not only is it one criteria, but it is also, I guess it's criterion, but it also is the tiebreaker. So if you and another team are tied, we compare RPIs. Who has the higher RPI, you're now seated higher. So that is why RPI has become such a huge part of the PairWise. It has almost dictates, if you look down the PairWise in a given year, it almost identically follows where you are in the RPI. So, and RPI has been used in many sports. This is not a hockey thing. This is something that's used in basketball. And you hear about it talked about a lot in men's basketball over the next week as they see their tournament. But RPI has become a really governing factor almost in the NCAA hockey tournament.
What's interesting also in this is up until the 2013-14 season, only the teams at 500 and above in the RPI were considered in the PairWise. By including every team now in the PairWise, what that also means is that if you had a head-to-head matchup in your league, say, maybe you played a team 4 times and lost 3 out of 4, and they won that head-to-head, they would pick up a comparison possibly in the PairWise, depending on some other factors, even though that they're way down in the RPI. So that's something that comes into play once in a while on the fringes. Every so often you get some fringe calculations in there. But I think what's really important about this to consider is how much your league's non-conference record has to do with your RPI. 75% of the RPI is really out of your control. It's your opponent's record and your opponent's opponents. In fact, 54% is your opponents against their opponents. And what that means is if your league has a poor out-of-conference record, that gets implicated very highly in your RPI and can hurt you. And you will see bands of that as you look at out-of-conference records. Atlantic hockey's best teams are hurt very badly by that and have a hard time to get into it. It's been that way with the WCHA in recent years. There have been a couple of years early on in the NCHC where a couple of the teams have had very poor out-of-conference records and brought the whole league down. So that's another factor there, too. Another thing that I wanted to point out, and this is more of a side note, but we hear it and we see it all the time, people disparaging the USCHO.com poll. It's like, well, the only thing that matters is PairWise. Well, PairWise, the only thing that matters is PairWise for seeding teams. But we have to remember that the PairWise is not necessarily about what the best teams are or even what the best teams are at the end of the season. It's about what teams meet the criteria for the NCAA tournament over the whole season. I'll give you an example. Right now, number 20 in the PairWise, but not in the USCHO.com poll, is Notre Dame. Early in the season, Notre Dame got as high as 3 in the poll. They were 7-0-1. Right now, nobody would put them in the top 20 teams in the country in the poll, at least the consensus of the poll voters, but they still are number 20 in the PairWise based on the whole season. And you can look at other things like that. You can look at how teams are doing. So, yeah, they each have their place. I would say the poll is a snapshot of what 50 people who are coaches and writers think about how teams are playing right now. The PairWise, it's the whole body of your work coming down to the very last day when all the games have been played to determine who gets in the tournament. Two different uses. To say one is useless and one matters doesn't make sense, especially when people say that in November when there's not enough data in the PairWise to mean anything.
Well, I think that's a good point. And what the reality is there's, as you kind of point out, two very different purposes of both the poll and the PairWise. The PairWise is something that was a development by the NCAA to figure out, and they didn't call it the PairWise, they call it the selection criteria. We finally put a name around it. It's called the PairWise now, but that is something that only matters on one day. We can watch it all year, but we only have to worry about it on one day, Selection Sunday. The poll, I think, is just something that it's something every sport has polls. It's just kind of a snapshot of how people feel teams are in a given week. We don't take into account polls in hockey. Football does. Think about football. They actually take into account where teams are voted in the polls each week in terms of how they select teams for the national championship. This in hockey, it is very statistical. It is very black and white. There is nobody's opinion thrown in there. There's no subjectivity. This is hockey. I think that people look to hockey as a model sometimes because of the fact that it was one of the first sports in the NCAA to go to a basis of objectivity as opposed to subjectivity. There's no smoke-filled rooms. There's nobody that's coming out and saying, oh, I voted for that team and that's why they're in. That's not how it works. And I think that that's what people kind of forget. The poll is very subjective. And I understand that. And there's two polls out there and they're both serve a great purpose. People get a good snapshot. People like to talk about where teams are ranked. Nobody wants to talk about where a team is in the PairWise on October 15th. They do want to talk about it now that it's approaching mid-March. Now it's much more important. But in the beginning of the season, you still want to know where your team kind of ranks. And there's good data out there that supports things that are good and bad. And that's what a poll is. And that's all it is. And listen, people can get fired up. I don't care what fans that don't want polls. Nobody requires fans to look at a poll on every Monday. And that's one of the things that always makes me laugh is, these polls don't matter. Okay, don't look at them. You're not required. There's no law. This is not a communist country that you have to look at polls. So let's get a little less fired up. I do want to go back to, though, your comment about strength of schedule, because there's good examples out there right now of teams that are either helped or hurt by their strength of schedule. One that I want to look at is Michigan. Michigan is 18-14-4, and they are 14th in the pairwise. That if the tournament started today, they would be in the NCAA tournament. The reason that an 18-win team with 14 losses can get to that point is because they have the 7th most difficult schedule in the country, according to strength of schedule. Minnesota, they are a bubble team at 16-14-7. They have the toughest schedule in the country, and that is noted. That's why the math actually works. It's putting them in a position. Clarkson, on the other hand, they are 23-8-3. They only have 8 losses. They have 23 wins. There aren't a ton of teams ahead of them that have 23 or more wins. Boston College has 24. Cornell has 23. North Dakota has 23. Nobody else is ahead of them in terms of number of wins in the pairwise, but they are number 9 in the pairwise because of the fact that they have the 41st most difficult schedule. So strength of schedule does really impact where you end up in the pairwise. So if you play a tough schedule, if your conference does very well in their out-of-conference schedule, your strength of schedule will rise. The Big Ten, one of the better conferences. Obviously, the NCHC, they were one of the better conferences. So you look at those teams, they're the highest in strength of schedule because of the fact that those conferences operated so well in non-conference play.
Well, Jim, why don't we turn to who right now, given the pairwise and what might happen to them down the road in league playoffs, or if they're already out, what might happen, who right now can we say is almost entirely a lock for the NCAA tournament? It's getting to be a bigger bunch of teams right now as we get closer.
I will give you 7 locks right now. North Dakota, Minnesota State, Cornell, Minnesota Duluth, Boston College, Denver, Penn State. Lock them in. They can't be eliminated. UMass and Ohio State are the next 2 that are really, really, really close. I would put them at, as close as you can possibly get. The team I skipped over there in the pairwise is Clarkson. Clarkson, I just mentioned their 41st strength of schedule. They will play a quarterfinal series this weekend, and if they get swept, I can't guarantee anything. If they make it past this weekend, no problem. Put them in. They're a lock. And you can say the same thing for UMass and Ohio State. I think that those 10 teams are probably all good, but the one team I point to in there is Clarkson, that if they get swept this weekend, they don't win a single game, even if they advance 2-1, I still have concerns that it's just such a minute chance, but I just like to always highlight those minute chances because I've been caught on this before where I don't think a team's going to get in and they're one or 2 wins away, 2 different scenarios or something like that can put them in. So I always try to be very honest. Clarkson, you almost can guarantee yourself a bid, but you need to make sure you don't get swept this weekend.
When there's still that tiny chance that a team could be eliminated, we have seen that before. Think back to when Yale won the national championship. They were swept in the EC semifinal and in the consolation game that year, went home a glum team on the bus, but lo and behold, they were the last team to make it in by just a tiny percentage point, went on to win the national championship. So there are situations, and you mentioned them, where we look at teams like UMass and Ohio State. There's less than a % chance that they don't make it, but the right combination of things could fall into play to put somebody else in. And so we'll have to watch for that. There's a whole bunch of teams on the bubble, and we don't need to spend too much time on that. In fact, it's probably a good time for us to turn to questions. We'll do that in just a moment after we remind you that our sponsor is the NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th in Detroit.
This is the USCHO Spotlight, a weekly podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online.
Every time you show up, every time you make your presence heard, whether you clap your hands or stomp your feet, lead the chant or join the chorus. However you choose to be a fan, you make the game. The NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th at Little Caesars Arena in Detroit. Visit ncaa.com/Frozen4 to get your tickets today.
Continuing with USCHO Spotlight for Wednesday, March 11th, 2020. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. And Jim, one team I think it would be worth mentioning that is sort of a bubble team right now and a team that can only sit and wait to see what happens in the rest of the season is Arizona State. They are not yet a lock, but better than 90%, probably in the mid-90s in making it in. What do things look like for Arizona State, and what are the things they have to be concerned about?
Well, I think one of the best things for Arizona State is the fact they can't lose. They can actually lower their RPI by losing. Yes, opponents can lose games that they've played throughout the season, and that can hurt you a little bit. But overall, their RPI probably does not go down in a negative way. I do think that when I look at Arizona State, you'd love to be higher. You'd love to be around 11 or 10, and they were there at some point not too long ago, but things have happened that both Bemidji, UMass Lowell, I think even Ohio State passed them by in the pairwise. So their whole thing is that they can't have upsets happen. They can't have teams that we'll call them below the cut line right now winning their conference tournaments, teams that are in the high teens, mostly the 20s and 30s in the pairwise that are still alive, winning their conference tournament. We know that Atlantic Hockey, in all likelihood, is a team that is 16 or below. So that's one team that you know. So 15 is your cut line right now. There are plenty of teams alive, and I know we're going to talk about it next, but there are a lot of teams that can still upset the apple cart. And it's the number of apple carts that get turned over. It's the number of teams that it's not just, there's 6 possibilities. Give Atlantic Hockey one that they're going to have a team outside of the top 16, but there's 6 different conferences that can all have teams outside of the top 16 win. That's the one thing that we always have to watch for. Those are the upsets that will take a team like Arizona State from 13 and push them all the way down to 17. That's out.
As we look at those teams, I think that there are 2 things. Besides that, you also have to look at where Arizona State might drop to. You look at their RPI at .5394. Michigan, Maine, Quinnipiac are all teams that are close enough to catch them in the RPI and maybe move Arizona State down a notch in the pairwise. You start getting down to about number 14, you've got to watch out for those upsets. And as we look at those upsets, there are a lot of teams that have a possibility of doing that, some that are close enough to getting into the at-large position based on wins, and some that are playing well enough to cause some problems. One team in the Big Ten, Minnesota, sitting outside at number 18. They could move in, as you mentioned. ECAC, Quinnipiac, Harvard, and Rensselaer are all teams that have a possibility of doing something in those playoffs and maybe even pulling an upset and winning. Rensselaer is number 36 in the pairwise right now, but the Engineers are playing terrific hockey. And if they make it and win the ECAC tournament up in Lake Placid, then that cut line goes from 15 to 14. Hockey East is another one. Providence has had trouble finding the back of the net, but the Friars are a very talented team. Northeastern in the same situation. And I wouldn't want to look past BU or UConn right now either. We could say the same thing in the NCHC with Western Michigan and St. Cloud State, a young St. Cloud team playing pretty well, and a Western Michigan team which is lower in the pairwise because they had some difficulty with injuries earlier in the season. And then WCHA, Bowling Green, and Michigan Tech, both teams that could be upset winners in that league. So each one of those teams that's below Arizona State or outside the top 15. Those are teams that can really wreak havoc. And I guess that's answering the question that we got from Alex, which remaining team is the biggest potential spoiler. All those teams that I just mentioned are potential spoilers.
Yeah, by my count, I believe there are 16 teams that are not in the top 20 of the pairwise right now. So listen, and the reason I go to 20 is because if you're 19, 18, 17, and you win your conference tournament, you're probably going to move into the top 15. So you can't be considered as knocking somebody out at that point. But teams that could win their conference tournament and not get into the top 16. I believe I have 16 teams. Let me just do the math again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 teams. I'm sorry, 15 that could all get into those spots despite the fact that they wouldn't be a top 16 team. So there's a lot of hockey to play. We always say that. That's a kind of a good cliche that coaches like to use. But once this quarterfinal weekend ends, I think we'll know a lot more. Of course, it's semifinal weekend for Big Ten and the WCHA. But once we get through this, we'll know a little bit more. But there's still plenty of opportunities. And you just pointed to so many teams. I mean, Quinnipiac, a really good team. I know there's 17. If they win the conference tournament, they'll be up into the 11, 12, 13 range. But you're looking at RPI, how well they're playing. Providence, that's a great team. Boston University is a very talented team. They could easily get in there. St. Cloud State, they played better in the second half. And then I think Bowling Green is the team that's a huge wild card in the WCHA. We know that they're a good team. They just had some struggles this year. So when these teams stop struggling at the right time, that is when magic happens. And suddenly, you become a team that everybody's considering an upset, and that moves that cut line. And to think that the cut line could move above 13, it's not a great chance, but the possibility is there. And if Arizona State is still at 13, listen, as you mentioned, Michigan goes on a little winning streak here. They pass Arizona State. Arizona State becomes 14. So there's a lot of stuff that could happen. So I'd love to say that they are close to in. They are. I'm above 90%, but 90% means 10 out of every 100 times you miss the tournament.
That brings us to another team that has been a surprise this year, a pleasant surprise for Maine fans. And then the Black Bears right now are in contention. They're on the borderline of being in the tournament. A couple of questions from Maine fans. Don asked if Maine wins 2 out of 3 against UConn, is that enough to get them in as an at-large, assuming they lose in the semifinal? And then another question about Maine that came from Brandon, asking what does Maine need to do in order to get into the tournament? 2 wins this weekend, 2 wins and a win in Boston. The thing that Maine cannot do, and Jim, you can elaborate on this, Maine needs to sweep UConn to have some assurance. If UConn wins one of those games, that takes Maine out of the top 16 in the pairwise, most likely. But if Maine wins 2 games this weekend, sweeps UConn, and makes it to the finals, and maybe loses in the finals, but makes it past the semifinals, they're almost a lock. So, boy, this is some big a big couple of weekends coming up for Maine.
Yeah, especially this weekend, I think, because as you said, if they advance but lose a game in there, I think that they could be hurt. That could put them in a precarious position, even if they get to the Hockey East final and lose. You sweep this weekend, I think you're in a lot better shape. I don't want to say that Maine has an easily predictable scenario. They just don't, because of so much that we just talked about Arizona State. I mean, Maine's below Arizona State. And we talk about the potential for upsets in other conference tournaments. That's what you have to watch for if you're a Maine fan. You're rooting for all the higher seeds, and you're rooting for your Black Bears to get to the Garden in 2 games. You get there in 3, then there's going to be work to be done. You're going to have to win a game at the Garden, I think, if you are unable to sweep this weekend. Sweep this weekend, I feel a lot better about Maine, but they don't sweep this weekend, and I think that they're going to have a much more difficult route, and they're obviously going to have to get to the Hockey East title game, and the chances are that we get to the last night, they might have to win it.
A team that you've followed very closely over the years is UMass Lowell, and we have a question about them from Frank. He asks, what is the likelihood of Lowell still grabbing a spot in the national tournament if they get bounced by BU this weekend in 3 games?
Really low. And I've had the conversation with Norm Bazin, UMass Lowell's head coach, and said it straight out. I think you have to get to the Garden. I think there's still a 9%, 10% chance somewhere in that range if they are unable to get there, but you can't hold out hope for that. That is the opposite of what we're talking about when we say 9 out of 10. 1 out of 10 is such a rarity, and you're going to be sitting there the entire conference weekend hoping for scenarios to happen. You're going to have to as we just mentioned about Maine, you're going to have to root for all the favorites. You're going to want all the number one seeds to win their tournaments, or high teams, at least in the pairwise. And you're going to want teams that you played against to have success. So in Lowell's case, that's Minnesota Duluth, that's Boston College, teams that you beat in difficult games that maybe give you a little bit of an RPI boost. But I think for Lowell, if you don't get out of if you don't get out of the quarterfinals this weekend, get to the Hockey East semifinals next weekend, there's not a lot of hope.
Well, let's turn to the Big Ten. There's a situation where a team does have some hope. And Joe asked, will the Big Ten get a second at-large team if both Penn State and Ohio State win the semis? And if there's a team that could do that, it would be Michigan. Michigan still has a chance, depending on how things fall. If they lose to Ohio State this weekend, Michigan still could sneak in as an at-large team if everything falls the right way.
I don't think their chances are great, but I think that there are chances that if Michigan were to lose this weekend, their RPI wouldn't be that heavily damaged by it. It might not be damaged at all. It might stay about the same. And that would leave them somewhere around 13, 14, 15 in the pairwise. Then you have to avoid the upset. The interesting thing about Michigan is if they win this weekend, there's no guarantee either. They don't get that much of a bump in the RPI that we would guarantee things. I mean, I think their chances would go from around 40% to 60 or 70%, but they still wouldn't be guaranteed. Michigan is in a very precarious position where they could maybe lose and still get in, but they could also win everything and lose in the conference finals and maybe not get in. It's a weird position for Michigan right now.
Well, we have a question here from our good friend Matt Wellens, who's the beat reporter for Minnesota Duluth with the Duluth News Tribune. Read his stuff. He's part of the Rink Live, also the website put together by those folks, a terrific hockey writer and somebody you'll want to keep tabs on. But he's asking, would empty arenas impact how the bracket is set up? NCAA bracket has several criteria. The first one is how you're ranked 1 through 16 based on the pairwise. You also have to take into consideration travel distance. They look at attendance and what regional would help attendance in that regional, and that's probably the criterion that would change if there's nobody in the arenas. And also in that they look at making sure you don't have first-round matchups between teams in the same conference. And also teams that are host institutions for the regional will be placed in that regional. So those are some of the things that come into play. But really, Jim, the idea of attendance, that could impact if there's nobody that's going to be attending. I know this is all very hypothetical right now, but as things are moving with the whole coronavirus situation, it's something worth discussing. If you had to take attendance out of putting together a bracket, how much easier does that make things?
It's a good question because it does make things a lot easier. And listen, as we've been sitting here recording, I think we're going on about 30 minutes right now. The World Health Organization has now declared coronavirus a pandemic, and the Golden State Warriors have now said that they will no longer have fans at games for the rest of the season. So this has become more real, and the thought that there won't be fans at a regional or a Frozen Four become a little bit more real. Whether it will happen, we're ways away from that, but maybe we're not. But you would think that it would make things easy. You would just then make sure that you have 1 through 16 seated perfectly, and maybe if you have a host team, they have to go where they have to go. You don't worry about attendance anywhere. All that said, now that we're in a state of pandemic, what do we do about airplane travel? Do we have teams hopping on airplanes or not? I remember very well after 9/11 when the NCAA said we want to keep teams as much as we can on a bus. And no matter what, you found a way to get to your regionals by bus if you could. You had to fly. Certain teams might have had to fly, but there weren't as many flights back then as in previous years. And that might be where we go as well. So there's a lot of things that we're going to have to think about. I think ideally you always want to see the bracket 1 through 16. 1 plays 16, 2 plays 15. You just get those, everything adds up to 17 in the first round. Then the next round, the winner of 1/16 plays 8-9. The winner of 2/15 plays 7-10. That's what the way a tournament is supposed to go. But we might not see that just because of both the host institutions. Obviously, Penn State, Denver both come into play there. And the other one, of course, is the thought that air travel might be limited. If air travel is limited, then we could see very different things. we're in a very interesting situation here. I don't know where this is going to go from now until the end of the day today on Wednesday. Forget about Friday. Forget about a week from Friday when the conference tournaments start. Forget about 2 weeks from now when the regionals start. Who knows where everything is going to go? Right now, I just think that the thing we have to worry about is whether this tournament gets played at all.
Yeah, that's a big question. And I know the NCAA has put together a coronavirus task force that is looking at things day by day. They put out an update yesterday saying, hey, they're still monitoring the situation. But even as you were just answering that question, breaking news in New York State, that State University of New York, all of the campuses, Governor Cuomo of New York has said they're going to distance learning as of March 19th. So there's another situation happening. And we just saw yesterday, on Tuesday, news that there were the first 2 outbreaks of the coronavirus in the state of Michigan. The governor's declared a state of emergency, one of those in Wayne County, one of those in Oakland County, not all that far from Detroit. And certainly there may be an impact. But I think the thing we have to remember in all of this is that things could happen very quickly. I saw the comment recently that people don't have a good mathematical understanding of the exponential. And there's the old story about if somebody paid you a penny on the first day of the month and 2 cents the second day and 4 cents on the third day, I can't remember the number, but it's a huge number. When things double very quickly like that, things can get out of hand very quickly. And the whole concern right now, from the way I understand it, is to kind of spread out the time period in which infection spreads so that the healthcare systems are not overwhelmed. And when you think about putting in a regional 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people in a building, or in the frozen 4, 15 or 20,000 people, the idea, and coming from all over the country and maybe outside the country, the idea of putting all those people together could cause something to take off. So we'll definitely be watching it. I know we just got our credentials approved, so they're expecting us right now in Detroit, but hopefully things work out and it won't be just a couple dozen media people, but a bunch of fans. But we'll definitely have to keep an eye on it. And I do not envy anybody who has to deal with this directly, whether it's medical people or even indirectly, people at the NCAA, Detroit Sports Commission, host schools. It's a very difficult situation that we'll be monitoring.
Yeah, and listen, I'm not an alarmist. That's not what I ever set out to do. I'd probably, err to the other side most of the times. But this has become pretty serious pretty quickly. And the notion that, keeping people out of large social places is understandable. Even this is Wednesday. I wrote on Monday that I thought it was a joke that RPI wasn't going to have fans at their game this weekend. Now, 2 days later, I think I might have been wrong. I'm not sure that this is definitely the right way to go. All that said, I don't think that games will be canceled, in my opinion. That's just an opinion. Again, by Friday, this might be different. By next Monday, this might be different, in my opinion. I'd hate to see that happen, but we're in a very strange place right now. This is not something that our country really has ever dealt with. This is not something that the world has ever dealt with. In the modern era, I know there were plagues and things that went on many, many, many years ago, and right now it's just a situation where we really don't know where we're going. So to go all the way back to Matt's question, and it was a very good one. Do you alter travel? Do you alter who has to go to what region if there are no fans? Yeah, maybe. Who knows? But we got to figure out if we're going to even play this tournament.
Well, we hope we do, and I know they're taking precautions. Teams are limiting water bottles to individuals, everybody using their own towel. Even the discussion about washing your hands, it's like the thing that really hit me about that is, really, people don't wash their hands? Please do us a favor. If you like our website, wash your hands, all right? Otherwise, we can't guarantee we'll be around forever, because if I find out you don't wash your hands, I'm not going to shake hands with you. Anyway, that's going to do it for this episode of USCHO Spotlight. We've been sponsored by the NCAA Frozen 4, April 9th and 11th in Detroit. For tickets, visit ncaa.com/Frozen4. For Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Spotlight, a production of U.S. College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.